What's up, DE students? Mr. Martinez here again, and this is History Talks. Welcome back, folks. Here we are going to learn a new topic with our new unit, which we're going to be focusing on urbanization and industrialization, specifically from 1865 to 1910. We're going to talk about the time period where America steps from its farm life into now the bustling cities of industrialization with factories, industries, and new opportunities that have not been seen for American society. This is going to be a very intense moment for American history, and we're going to look through it with these things in mind. Here's our objectives, folks. We're going to look at how America enters into the industrial age, whether that 1870s to early 1900s, how America leads the second industrial revolution, mentioning how there are others of these, of course. We'll also talk about the roots of American industrial superiority, talking about the titans of industry later to come, and also the growth of urban America. These are going to be the things we're going to talk about with all of this in mind, with our essential question, which is how does industry and technology impact a society? How does these things change fundamentally how a society operates? That's what we're going to be looking at with this industrial revolution. So let's first mention and just take a moment to acknowledge the fact that this is a huge makeover for America. America was born on the farm and moved into the city. In 1860, most Americans lived in rural areas, with only 16% living in towns or cities with a population of 8,000. By 1900, though, that percentage had doubled, and nearly 15 million Americans would live in cities with populations of more than 50,000. This is a huge move from that space into the countryside, into this condensed, urbanized city. Migration to urban areas during this time changed the demographics and statistical characteristics of the population of the United States. This period was the beginning of an upsurge in urbanization that both reflected and fueled massive changes in the way Americans lived. So, like we mentioned, Industrial Revolution is a huge moment for us. It changes everything about how our society is to operate and has purpose in this new system. Now, we call it Industrial Revolution. Other people call it Gilded Age. There's a lot of different terms out there. When we talk about industrialization, there's two ways to think of it. Here's one way to imagine when we talk about industrialization. Think of it as making products in factories and producing goods using machines. That is a huge difference from what was before, which was doing things by hand in your small community. If you wanted to find a nice chair, you would really have to hope to find someone within your community who has that skill, if not you. None of you guys have it, you're probably not going to have a chair. It was simple as that with how many things were accessible to you based on the limitations of resources in your region and the skill sets in your community, if not your own. So this is a huge move from that to then getting your needs and wants from the store. This is huge. The US industrialized this phase of second industrial revolution. In early 1800s, the US had its first phase of industrialization. It's important that we note that this is the second industrial revolution we're focusing on, as the first was right before the Civil War. And that, of course, was the conversation of railroads and certain other productions in agriculture that were speeding up the amount of produce they were creating for people. But this one is focusing on more of the larger manufacturing power that comes with the Industrial Revolution. If you look at my images right here, it really does make sense of the whole idea of what we mean by factory, which is a place that produces goods, tools, which is now these machine operated devices that are able to help people, no longer just hand use equipment. And of course, goods being anything, frankly. It could be initially clothes, which is textile industry, later into other smaller goods, and to then innovations and technology of things that we didn't even think we needed. Those are the things that we come out that will be from the goods. With that being said, though, it's important to note that this second industrial revolution and the first industrial revolution does not come from strictly America, though we perfect this system. It was actually copied from Great Britain, as they were one of the first to come up with this new way of creating and producing. So how did America catch on to the bandwagon? Well, that Civil War really helped out. The Civil War, with the fact of producing war goods and getting industrialization, forced northern factories to produce faster and more efficiently for the sake of war times. Of course, once war was over, these factories were turned into other ways of producing and contributing to society than just weapons. And this, of course, kickstarted the Gilded Age. Now, Gilded Age, the way that we're going to explain it is just the period when the United States went through the second major industrial phase. But the naming of it is double-sided. Gilded is the idea that something is, imagine something gold and shiny, but inside it is rather not shiny. It's not pretty, it's darker. That's what the Gilded Age is. This is all nice, the innovations in industry. It does so much for our country and people, but it's not to say that it comes with some rot and destruction too. And that's what we're going to be talking about as well. During this time, major developments in science and technology will change life forever. And that is true as we are still going through the next industrial revolutions within our time period. Now, America, like I said, is the best at this eventually. And because of our position, we start to be in a very good world manufacturing position when competing with other countries. Take a look at this chart real quick. As you can see, from 1880, America is kind of still kind of showing itself and its characters within the global market. We're not first place nor second, we're getting somewhere in the middle. But in 1900, we start to be more recognized. By 1913, we are the dominant market that is producing and manufacturing for the world. So we do take over pretty quickly within this. Now, a couple other vocab things that we should mention. Urbanization. Urbanization, industrialization. They kind of come together. They kind of sound like the same thing, but let's divide the two. We just mentioned industrialization, which is that widespread development of industries in a region. So because of all these factories and all of these new produce that are coming out, it creates corporations and businesses and industries, which is that term, for a region within that market. None of those things could exist if it wasn't for the workers and people who start these factories, which starts urbanization, which is the movement of the populations from rural to urban areas. What moved farmers and people from the countryside to move to this new urban city with skyscrapers and all these new things that have never been seen before. That is what we're talking about with urbanization. Take a look at this urbanization chart with me real quick. We're talking about when people are migrating, and look at the patterns we see on this. Of course, if you look at the key on the bottom left-hand side, you see the blue is what the population was in 1870. The yellow is how much it expands by 1900, and the level of how many people are condensed in. As you can see, it is very booming, and the places are very strategic. As you can see, a lot of the major cities are going to be on the coastal line or by some body of water. Another interesting note to make is where these cities are popping up more so and where they're popping up hardly. As you can see, the South, in this new South that has been created after the Civil War, it still lacks that industrialization. So you see, it does not see the same amount of growth, but it's booming up north. And that is huge for our country. Once again, analyze that map with one more time. What were the trends that you saw within the population growth of the cities from east to west? What were some of the notes that we just made on that? Go ahead and answer that on giving me examples of urbanization. Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. So let's talk about more of the causes for urbanization. So if industrialization does not happen without urbanization, well, what starts urbanization? Well, agriculture revolution. And that's the initial first industrial revolution, which was how we started using more machinery devices to be able to help us yield more produce during season. So let's talk about this in a factor of push and pull factor. If you don't know push and push factor are those that compel people to leave their homes, such as famine, war, or persecution. Pull factors is what draws people to a new location. So if push factor is pushing someone out, pulling is drawing them into somewhere, into a new place. Typically, this is because of economic opportunity or religious freedom. So in this circumstance of urbanization, the reason why people are being pushed out of the farmland is because farming was not easy for everyone. It was not an easy thing. Big farmers with the technological advantages from the first industrial revolution, where they used those new machineries, they had an upper hand on the small farmers, and they started to squeeze the small farmers out with more competitive markets. So small farmers, if successful or not, were being squeezed out of their market. And living in rural areas made it hard to have access to new products, services, and innovations at the time. With all this new kind of opportunities that exist for people, it's hard to want to stay stationary, especially if stationary isn't comfortable with the circumstances of seasons, of yields, and of course, with competition. But pull factor, why to the cities? Why not somewhere else? Well, the cities had these new businesses and factories that were behind the Industrial Revolution, the new one. And we're located in the nation's cities and towns. So to find new opportunities would have to bring you to the city. Despite the tedious nature of work, factories in the cities often offered workers more money and opportunities that they had in rural settings. So with new opportunities comes the ability to build new skills, becoming more of a asset, which means you can make more money. This all is what happens when people leave the farmland as self workers to then work for somebody, get the money, use that money to go buy new things you've never had before, or get that was easier than what was in your rural community. All of this is, of course, possible too with the railroad transportation. Being able to move that far, that quickly, is also a benefit to many who then get to the cities. So this is the causes. How quickly does this happen? Well, look at this chart, comparison rural to urban population. This happens quite drastically. In 1860, most people, 80%, will be in the countryside, 20% in these cities. But look what happens quickly. By 1910 to 1920, you're seeing that half of Americans are living in cities and the other half are living in farms. And if you're curious what this percentage looks like now, 99% of Americans live in urbanized communities, while only 1% are our rural farmers. That's a big difference between what was once the farmers and workers of cities and farms. Answer this question. What drew Americans to move into nation cities in the late 19th and early 20th century? What was it that was that push and pull factor for urbanization? Answer that for me real quick before we continue. Well done. Let's move on with industrialization and urbanization powered by that railroad we were mentioning. is so hard for us to understand why the train was such a big deal. We have to think about how humans went from being on foot to then using animals to then using machines to help us move. And in this time period we're talking about, transportation is huge. First trains, then cars, but now trains right here is a really optimal spot. The first big businesses that America has is within railroad industries. And the railroad industry also fueled other industrialized factories and produce and the US economy. So it had a huge impact, huge. And it was something that America was known for in its industry first. Of course, this wouldn't have happened without the aid of the government. And these land grants that we're mentioning here are the ones that came with the Civil War. And this is where America vastly expanded its railroad industry and railing. We went from 1865 having only 35,000 miles of train tracks to then by 1900 having 192,556. That is so much. 192,556 miles of trains is huge for the connecting of this continent and to fund the markets that now will ride those train tracks. The major goal of the government was to finish this train project, really connecting East and West finally. And this is the Transcontinental Railroad. This was a huge moment for America when we were able to connect our country finally from East to West. No longer would those people have to take the great trails across, but now go on trains and machinery that gets them across easily. Now, how are these things built? Well, these things are built, of course, by people. And we're going to mention the people who are the workers and who contributes to these things. When it comes to these railroad factories, a lot of them are going to be immigrants. A lot of immigrants that we're going to mention pretty soon in our class, which is Irish and the Chinese immigrants. The Union Pacific using Irish and the Central Pacific using Chinese. This transcontinental project was completed in 1896 or 1889, which was a big deal. Take a look at the map of what becomes this whole train project of connecting our country, and take a look at how this connects our country initially. These are the main veins of our US economy initially. Of course, we don't have roads yet that expand across like highways and interstates, but at this time, this is our first main veins for the US economy. Now, all of this comes with a cost. Like we said, this is the Gilded Age. There's greatness, and there's also struggle that comes with it and issues. Urban living creates social issues. Urbanization led to many social issues caused by overcrowding and poverty. In 1890, New York's Lower East Side had a population of more than 70 people per acre. As immigrants and rural migrants arrived, they crowded into neighborhoods and already seemed to be overfilling. The wealthy lived in urban mansions while the poor crowded in tenement homes, apartment buildings with tiny rooms, no ventilation, and poor sanitation. We're going to look a lot at this later in class, especially with certain technological advancements that help us first witness these great things that are happening within the cities. Things like cameras and photography that now document what life is like during these times of the past. We're going to look at what this living conditions and working conditions are of the Industrial Revolution. But what we understand is that these cities become too congested with not enough city planning that leads to disaster. But all of this, once again, is gilded. As the city grows further and further up to try to expand, it goes into the sky with these new skyscrapers, new steel making procedures that create stronger buildings that have never existed before. These buildings will help build the strength of the US economy that comes with the second industrial revolution. The diversity of the nation's cities was nowhere more on display than the nation's largest city, which was New York City. At the turn of the 20th century, New York City was the national capital of finance, industry, shipping, and trade. The population, 3 million in 1900 and 4.7 million in 1910. Can you believe that? In 10 years, getting 1.7 million more people in that city. That is going to come with some price. And that's what we're going to look at in another class period. Perfect. And as we close today, folks, I just wanted to go ahead and close on this video that really shows the momentum that comes with the Industrial Revolution and how quickly we expand across what was left of this continent, finally connecting the farthest reaches of east to west connection within the US government. This is a huge moment. As you guys can see, the train tracks spread rather quickly, and the yellow representing the dense populations that exist within the urbanization that comes with industrialization. This is a huge moment for America, as now we have reached the farthest boundaries of this continent. We finally made the manifest destiny that we wanted. Of course, at the expense of those who came before. Those who came before, the indigenous communities, will be put into the native reservations, where there they will either be in a condition that is far adequate, or be considered being assimilated into this new society that lives all around this reservation, all that exists now in this new world that comes with the United States. This is a big moment. And I want you to recognize that as this momentum still continues today. But folks, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you guys going through this video and learning with me. But this will be it for today's lecture. We're going to go ahead and continue this conversation later in class. But until then, I'm Mr. Martinez, here signing out. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.